Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants Hangout. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I'll be your host for today. Those who have been following along all month long know that we've been celebrating the adventure of a new year. We've been talking to explorers and adventurers from all over the world who push the limits to discover and find new things. But we've also been learning a lot about setting goals, resiliency, not giving up, all those really good things that can really help you, whether you're planning an expedition or planning for the school year. So I'm really excited today to be joined by Paul Rose. Paul is one of the world's most experienced divers, field scientists, and polar experts. He helps scientists unlock and communicate global mysteries in the most remote and challenging regions of the planet. He's also an experienced television presenter and radio broadcaster, and is currently the expedition leader for the National Geographic Pristine Seas expeditions. He was also base commander of Rothera Research Station in Antarctica for 10 years. So, Paul, it's so great to have you joining us today. You're a man on the move. We're catching you in the airport today. How are you doing? All good, Paul?
All good.
Oh, yeah. Awesome. So you are in Zurich right now in the airport.
I am. I'm in Zurich. I've just come back from a terrific adventure. I've been to Ljubljana, which is the capital of Slovenia. And there is an enormous industrial plant where they take abandoned fishing nets that have either been washed up on beaches throughout the world or fishing nets that have been recovered from the sea. And they're the really tricky ones because when a fishing vessel loses its nets, the net floats around in the water and still is fishing. So it's catching thousands and thousands of fish that just die. So it collects all those nets, brings them to the great industrial plant in Slovenia, Ljubljana is the name of it, and turns it into new fabric, beautiful new fabric for making carpets. And it's a hugely successful business. And it was a really great few days to see it happening.
Very cool. Some of you may have heard Paul and I talking just before we started the event about how it's a really cool time because people are really looking for innovative ways to tackle some of the issues that we're facing. And I showed Paul this really cool skateboard. This is a skateboard from Chile, and they take the fishing nets and they make it into skateboards. So lots of cool ways we can reuse some of the things that we're throwing away.
It's been fun because Joe and I were talking that we feel as if we're living through a revolution. 15, 20 years ago, a lot of these new ideas weren't even thought about. But every single day, I come onto a really smart, clever, sustainable idea. In this case, it's skateboards and sunglasses from rubbish and nets. And I'm talking to a great carpet company that's making carpets from nets and other weights. So we're living through a revolution. High and lucky times indeed.
Absolutely. So, Paul, let's dive a little deeper into what you get up to, what makes you tick. So recently we've been hosting you a lot from different places around the world, Colombia, the Azores, as the expedition lead for the Pristine Seas team. Can you tell us a little bit about Pristine Seas and what your job is?
Yeah, well, firstly, it seems very strange to speak to you, Joe, from not rolling around at sea on an expedition boat, But yes, I lead the Pristine Seas expeditions at National Geographic. We've had 27 of these expeditions, and our job is to find, explore, and help protect the last wild, truly pristine places of the ocean. We look at the ocean as being something that's under pressure. It's under pressure from climate change, from pollution, overfishing, you name it. And so it's a bit like a bank account, constantly putting it under pressure and taking stuff out. Well, as you know, and we all know, you just can't keep taking your money out of the bank or you'll have nothing. So what we do is we protect these last wild places, and that's our way of putting something in the savings account. And so far, we've protected almost 6 million square kilometers of the ocean. So it's a good old project, and the next one is to Costa Rica in a few weeks.
Absolutely incredible. Are you on that one?
Yes, I'm leading that one, and it'll be a great one because there's a beautiful part of Costa Rica called the Osa Peninsula, which is in the southwest, and it's the Pacific side. And the Osa Peninsula, see if you have a chance to look it up. It's OSA Peninsula. It is called by National Geographic and David Attenborough and all these other luminaries the most biodiverse place on Earth. And it is absolutely beautiful. So that peninsula is beautifully protected. But the Costa Rican government want to extend that protection 200 miles out in the sea and create a very large marine protected area. And that's where I fit in. I'm taking the team there, and we're going to do all the marine science to help the government protect it.
All right. Well, it sounds incredible. I'm wildly jealous here in frozen Canada. My diving, I'm gonna have to cut a hole in the ice in the quarry, and that's how we'll be diving for the next little while. So when you talk, I mean, Costa Rica is an amazing country. They've done a lot of good work protecting the land, and it's very exciting that they're extending that out into the oceans. Now, when you find these places, these pristine places, what's it like to dive in those places?
One of the first things that we love to experience on that very first dive in a new place where we've never seen is the understanding that we are no longer the top of the food chain. We jump in and we're surrounded by sharks. And it's a wonderful, we go, oh yeah, okay, the ocean, what's at the top of the food chain? Not human beings. No matter how much diving gear we're wearing, we're not the top of the food chain. So it's the sharks, and it's that wonderful sense of we haven't done any measurements yet. We're just swimming around, getting to know the region. And that's the instant instinct. You see all the big fish. We see the very old fish, you know, the grouper and the cod that live to, 30, 40 years old. We see the big fish, the top predators, everything in balance. And in that first 1 minute, you can look around, and I look to my team, and we're all looking at each other with that look that goes, yes, we're in a pristine place. And it's that wonderful feeling. It's hard to describe, but imagine jumping in the sea, being surrounded by sharks, knowing that you're no longer top of the food chain. It's a great thing.
That's absolutely incredible. Well, we'll have to talk later about your connectivity and see if we can pull something off.
Sure, let's do it.
On that
We have great connectivity, Joe, and we're on the same vessel. I spoke to you from Colombia, so we can do it.
Perfect. Let's do it. Right. Awesome. So, Paul, obviously, you're a very well-recognized scuba diver. You've been diving in crazy places all around the world. What about some of your polar expeditions? So 10 years as the commander of a research station in Antarctica. Can you tell us a little bit about your polar experiences?
Yeah, I was very lucky because like a lot of people who are commercial divers and commercial mountain guides, which is my background, there's a sort of natural progression. You climb and dive in your own region and your own ranges, and then you go a bit further afield and go to the greater ranges in mountaineering terms and go to the deep, faraway places in oceanic terms. And then there's, for people that have an explorer's mindset, it's what next? And the what next is inevitably the polar regions. And that's when I discovered a beautiful organization called the British Antarctic Survey. In America, it's the National Science Foundation. And they run, all of these countries run big, important science projects in the polar regions to understand about us and about humanity and the environment and conservation. So I applied for a job and they said, what sort of job do you want? And I remember saying anything, whatever you have, anything that will get me to the Antarctic. And they needed mountain guides. So I went south as a mountain guide, working on the American side of Antarctica, but working for the British. And I ran 3 big expeditions there for volcanologists, scientists who specialize in volcanoes. And then I ran a big project on the British side of Antarctica, on the peninsula. And at that point, the British Antarctic Survey recognized that I had a lot of logistics experience, and they offered me the job as the base commander. So I went, wow, base commander of an Antarctic research station, yes, please. And I did that job for 10 years, and I tell you, it's a real privilege, because you can imagine you have scientists who have a complex plan. You know, the right term is a hypothesis. The scientists have a scientific hypotheses. You know, what is it that drove climate change in the past? What's driving it now? What's happening with the air? What's happening with the marine life? What's happening with the tiny grasses and the insects in Antarctica? What's happening with the penguins? So they have a hypothesis, and it might mean taking certain samples. It might mean taking certain measurements in these remote, difficult places. And sometimes not just once, but maybe for 7 years to get a big enough data set. So I would love to meet with the scientists, discuss their hypothesis, and then it was my job to turn that hypothesis into airplanes, ships, skidoos, divers, climbers, skis, climbing gear, boats, and make it happen. And I used to love that. I still love that. I think that is a skill I learned in Antarctica, and it's something I do right now, even with my work at Pristine Seas. So there's something very special about working in Antarctica, which is at the end of the world's longest supply chain, doing hugely ambitious projects for scientists. And I love that thing, making it happen.
So, Paul, I bet with all those logistics, there were times things went smoothly, and there were times things really didn't go smoothly at all. Can you talk a little bit about that flexibility or that that you had to have to kind of conquer those situations?
Absolutely. You've got to be prepared because, you know, in life, we tend to always have a plan A. And we assume, don't we, that the telephone's going to work, that the flight. Sorry, Joe, got you. Yeah, lost you there. And so we always assume these things are always going to work. But the reality is, as soon as you get away from civilization and get in these long supply chains, things stop working. For instance, what do you do about your project when the ship bringing all your gear in gets stuck in the ice for 2 weeks? So the ship is 2 weeks late. And some Antarctic projects are only 3 weeks long. Others, of course, are many years. So when ships get stuck in the ice, it's really bad weather. Everybody has to have a plan B. Everybody has to have a plan B. It's my main bit of advice. So maybe if you can't do all of your work, you can do enough work to salvage that bit of the season, you know. So travel with your light gear, travel with your essential comms gear, travel with the essential bits of scientific equipment so that you can pull off some kind of success. So you've got to have a plan B. And the other thing, as you rightly said, Joe, wow, you've got to be resilient, you've got to be tough, so that when your dream project and the dream season is lined up and suddenly collapses, you've got to manage it somehow. You know, it's just one of them things, and people have to be, you've got to be strong, you've got to be resilient, you've got to be super flexible. And back to the beginning, you better have a plan B.
All right, so we talked a little bit about your time in Antarctica. Now, I know you spent time in the Arctic, and you had a run-in one time with one of the Arctic's larger predators, didn't you?
I certainly did. Just a couple of years, Joe. A couple of years ago, I was running a project again for National Geographic Pristine Seas, and we were up at the Northwest Passage. And you know, the Northwest Passage years ago was thought, could there be a possible sea route between the Atlantic and the Pacific going around the top of Canada? And it was thought impossible. But now with climate change or global warming, that now does open, and there is water up there, and ships do pass across the north, unbelievably, even tourist ships. So we were up there doing a story about the changing in the ice. I'd arrived early and was camped on a very remote, beautiful beach. And you know, when you're camping and we're geared up for very cold weather. Well, the weather wasn't that cold. It was about maybe -2. There was no wind. It was 24-hour daylight. So it was beautiful. It felt much warmer than it really was. And I was in my tent. It was about 2 a.m. And I could hear very soft, light snow hitting the outside of my tent. And it was the most perfect evening. I was half asleep. I was warm, so I was laying on top of my bag, no clothes on. I'd had a long, hard day setting up the camp, and it was just me in heaven. You know, it's a wonderful feeling. And then all of a sudden, bang, a 900-pound polar bear landed on me. I was just, luckily, all the sharp bits, its teeth and claws missed me by about 6 inches. But this huge, white, heavy, smelly thing landed on me, pushed my head and shoulders down into the ground. I jumped up. The tent was ripped, and all the snow that I was enjoying hearing suddenly was coming in on me. And I sat there thinking, holy smokes, polar bears just jumped me. I was looking around. I thought, well, I'm actually okay. There were some big holes in the tent, obviously, big holes on the tent floor and on my sleeping pad, but I was all right. And I sat there frightened to move. I thought, well, should I get the gun? Shall I get the flares? And I decided I would just be really quiet. And my heart rate was at max. I could hear it going bang, 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 bang. So I slowed it down, just concentrated, slowed it down, and thought, well, where is this bear? It was just completely silent. So I went to the front of my tent and opened up the inner tent, and then very quietly opened up the outer tent. And about this far away, about arm's length, were these two huge brown eyes looking at me. So I stared at him for not long. It felt like a long time, maybe a half a minute. Didn't even dare blink. And he walked off. I said, oh, great. He's walked off. So then I started shuffling around and getting my down coat and hat and getting the rifle. But he heard me shuffling and ran at the tent. And I thought, well, that's it. You know, he's running. And he looked enormous. But he just walked around my tent for 45 minutes and walked out on the frozen sea ice and was gone. That's what you call lucky.
That's unbelievable. And I know now you can laugh about it and, but at the time I can only imagine what you were going through for that period of time.
Every time I talk about it, I get a bit sweaty. I've got a bit hot.
Crazy. Well, Paul, maybe the last thing I'll ask you about before we start meeting some classrooms is we live in this amazing planet. We only have one of them. We need to live on this planet in balance. How have you seen the planet changing since you first started your expeditions to today?
Well, the first thing I would say, we're all so much more connected. So that is a wonderful thing. I remember working with scientists. I remember being on my own expeditions. We go off and do something and think, I'd love to share this with somebody. Because look what's happening. We've just climbed something that's never been climbed before. We've just dived something. We've discovered a new shipwreck. We've seen these new things. I'm with scientists and they go, wow, no one's got these samples before. This is going to show how the climate has changed in the past or whatever it might be. And we couldn't share those stories for a long time. We'd have to get back home and we'd have to write reports and try and get them on television and tell people about them. But now we can instantly share the new things that we discover and challenges we face. And that has really changed my life, of course, and all of my colleagues' life, but it's changed everybody's life because we can all communicate. You put on your television or open up your social network feed or have a check on Google or anything, you can plug into great adventures at the front line of discoveries. And that's a huge thing. And the second thing I've seen is there's a lot more people. I mean, the world's population has tripled since I was born. I was born in 1951. And the world's population has more than tripled. So places are busier. It's a little bit harder to find the wild places, but they're all still out there, of course. And the next thing I've noticed is it's got warmer. It's definitely got warmer. When I first started working in the polar regions, and when I look at the polar regions now, they're very different. And of course, they're also different here in Zurich or in your regions in Canada. It's just that they don't look very different, but they look very different in Antarctica because of the ice changes. And so, so it's the communications, the fact there's more of us, and it's all a bit warmer.
All right. Well, Paul, I think we should meet some of our classrooms.
Yes, please.
All right, here we go. Let's see. Let's go to Mrs. Jeffrey's group first. There's some grade 4 students hanging out with us in Bradford, Ontario, here in Canada. Let's get their mic on. How are we doing, grade 4s?
Good.
All right. Who's got a question for Paul?
Owen. What hobbies did you have when you were a child?
Oh, great. What hobbies did I have? It's a really great question. For me, my biggest hobby was running and cycling. When I was small, I liked the speed and the sense of movement. So I used to love to run and cycle. I'd do anything to get out and get some distance going. And then as I got a little bit older, I discovered that I was pretty okay at climbing. So I was climbing trees, climbing buildings, climbing rocks, climbing everything. And eventually that turned into my being a mountain guide. And then also how swimming turned into diving. When I was about 6 or 7, I was swimming a lot. I grew up in England, which is cold water, and I had no trouble being in the cold water. I remember my parents forbidding me to go back in the sea because I was blue and purple and different shades of coldness, and me begging them to let me get back in. So running and cycling, and then swimming and climbing, anything physical.
All right. Awesome. Good question to start us off.
Thank you.
Let's go to Mrs. Searson's group. They're in Douglas, Ontario. Some grade 3s hanging out with us. Let's get their microphone on. How are we doing, Douglas?
Good.
Oh.
Hi. What is the biggest animal in the Arctic?
The biggest animal in the Arctic. Oh, great. Yeah, well, the biggest terrestrial animal for sure is the polar bear. I mean, there are the muskox, which are pretty darn big, but it's the polar bear that is the biggest. And then in the water, it's the whales. The whales are just so big, just so beautiful. So it's that wonderful presence of everywhere you go in the Arctic, there's something powerful happening. On land, it's the muskox and the polar bears being the biggest. And in the sea, it's the whales. An interesting thing is when there's sea ice and we're diving underneath the sea ice, even if we don't see any whales, we can always hear them because they're their calls are reflected even further because that's bouncing off under the ice. And so we're always aware that we're in the presence of giants.
All right. Well, I had the pleasure of visiting the Natural History Museum a couple days ago. Absolutely phenomenal. Everybody has to spend time in that museum. But I remember looking at the polar bear that they have there in the mammal section and looking at the paw, the size of that. Unbelievable.
Yeah, giants indeed. Yeah.
All right. Let's see. Let's go to Vienna, Virginia. Miss Stevenson's class is joining us. Some grade 5s. Let's get their microphone on. How are we doing, boys and girls?
Sarah, question?
No, what? What is the coldest ocean you've ever been in?
The coldest ocean you've ever been in?
Oh, yeah, cold. Great question. It is the Southern Ocean. All of my dives in Antarctica, and I dived there for many, many years and still do, the water is usually approximately -2 Celsius. So it's below freezing, but it's salty enough that it hasn't frozen. It's very cold water, that, because at the surface, you can see in front of your mask tiny frozen spicules of ice in that top 3 to 6 feet. So the top bit is like diving in a mixed ice drink. And then at depth, it's just still really cold. It's always about -2. So then we use dry suits. You know, we're wearing great diving suits, which are dry. So underneath, we're wearing really good insulated clothing. Similarly, we're wearing dry gloves and all that. So we're not very cold when we're diving, but it's just that afterwards, you know, when your gear's a bit wet, you've put a lot of energy keeping warm, then it's afterwards when it's cold. But when we're in the sea, we're not cold at all because we've got very good equipment.
I know that feeling really well, except I don't have really good equipment. I still dive wet in the winter.
Okay.
And I don't feel it in the water, but when I get out, oh man, I'm cold.
Good man.
All right. You got to be tough to be Canadian.
Oh, yeah, I love it. Yeah.
All right. So let's take a trip to Riverside in the US. We have some high school students hanging out with us. Let's get their microphone on. Where is it? There it is. How's it going, boys and girls?
How often do your scientific research and environmental concerns overlap, and how has that changed over time?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, well, all of our decision making is based on scientific fact, and that's the thing. So, for instance, a good example would be when we were working in the Seychelles. The Seychelles government was super keen to protect their marine protected area and make it bigger and enlarge the scale of it and make that lovely commitment of committing to 30% of their waters, which is huge, and protect and connect all the other protected areas so it became this massive marine protected area. And they felt that because of the challenges that they faced, that we needed to tell that story by the young people, the young Seychellois, so that when we made the film, it was the young Seychellois that was speaking and not me and my team, you know. So that meant that we knew how we would tell the story. But of course, we can't change the facts. The facts are from the science. And so that's the lovely balance of the work I do. It's the science team that pull together the results. How is this region? Is it pristine? Is it under threat? If it's under threat, if it was protected, could it be saved? And so it's that lovely balance of hard, indisputable science fact, and then all, which we can't change, but then using the content in a creative way to help the political leaders and decision makers make the smart decisions. So there's always that lovely balance where one complements the other. And I must say that's a great thing to pull together and one of the most satisfying parts of my job.
All right, so let's jump back into Canada. We're going to go to Nova Scotia this time, head out to the East Coast. We've got some grade 3s hanging out with us, with Mrs. Morin. Let's get their microphone on, see how they're doing. How are we doing, grade 3s?
Hi. Hi.
Have you ever seen a whale?
Oh, yeah, I have. There's something wonderful about seeing whales. I've seen whales a lot of my life, from the surface and, of course, when I dive. And I remember some particular whale ones. Sometimes when I've been in Antarctica, working with the scientists, facing a wall. Imagine being deep at sea, but facing a deep wall, looking at all the life on the wall, and feeling myself sort of swaying around like that, thinking, wow, and looking around and realize it was a pod of orca, a pod of killer whales going behind us. And their movement was so powerful of their tails that actually pushed us around. And that was a beautiful feeling to see this large pod of orca, or being in the Sea of Cortez and jumping in snorkeling to film with BBC a project on the Sea of Cortez, and being in the water. And as the whales, you know if you know, but now whales help find their way around and communicate by making big booming sounds. And I was boomed a few times. And I found that really emotional, to be in the sea, holding my breath, swimming down, looking at the whales out there. And as they came around and faced me, to feel the boom in the chest, you go, oh yeah, you know, I've just been boomed by a whale. And because they're so big compared to us, and of course they're beautiful and iconic species, but there's something very wonderful about diving and swimming with these things. And of course they're huge and make us feel so very small.
All right, we're going to head to North Bay, Ontario. Grade 5-6 is hanging out with Mrs. Larmer. Let's get their microphone on. There we go. How's it going, 5-6s?
Hi, my name is Annie, and did you always want to be a diver even when you were a kid?
I did. That's a lovely question. Did I always want to be a diver when I was a kid? Yeah, I did. I grew up in London, and I didn't have any divers in the family. You know, my parents weren't divers, my grandparents weren't divers. But I remember watching on television. You know, I was watching Jacques Cousteau, and he was having terrific adventures traveling around the world with his team. I was watching Hans and Lottie Haas, who are an Austrian pair, and they were doing wonderful photography underwater. And there was even a man called Mike Nelson, who's a fictional character, Mike Nelson, but he was on a wonderful American television series called Sea Hunt. And Mike Nelson was having really great adventures every week. You know, he was rescuing men from flooded mines. He was discovering gold and jewels. He was rescuing pilots that had crashed their airplanes in the sea. So between the science work of Jacques Cousteau, the photography of Hans and Lottie Haas, and the sheer adventures of Mike Nelson, when I was 11 years old, I was determined to be a diver. And, you know, I never forgot it. And I was just dreaming. And I wonder if I hadn't seen those programs, if I'd even be a diver. I was just hooked on that. And seeing them coming to life in television meant that I knew I was going to be a diver. I just felt it within me.
That's awesome, Paul. It's so good to not only have passions, but not to give up on them. To
Yeah,
keep
that's
them,
right.
and to push and to go after what is so important. And you know, for me growing up, it was Jacques Cousteau and it was David Attenborough.
Oh, yeah.
And, yeah. So, yeah, it can really influence your life going forward, having those role models, those good role models.
Yes, exactly.
All right. Well, Paul, how's your time? Do you have time for a few more questions?
I've got time for a couple more questions. Yeah, then I better go get my flight to. I'm going to Manchester to go to do some work for the BBC.
All right, perfect. I was just at the Natural History Unit visiting a friend in Bristol, which is really cool.
Beautiful, BBC.
All right. Hands up, boys and girls. We should visit your class again. We'll try and get a few more questions in. Of course, every class. Let's start with Mrs. Stevenson's class. Your microphone's on.
Emma?
What about me? So I was wondering, which ocean have you been in that has the most trash? And going through the oceans, how much trash do you think is in them?
Well, that's a great question. Which ocean have I been in that's had the most trash? Well, it's been the Indian Ocean for sure. That seems to have a lot of trash. But the trouble is from a diver's perspective, we only see little bits of it. And of course, because all the oceans are connected, it means that there is trash in all of them. And the way the ocean gyres and the ocean currents move around, it moves between each group. But it's been the Indian Ocean that I've witnessed personally most trash. No one really knows how much is in there. I mean, we make estimates as to how much we might be putting in, and they're always horrific. There's a thing on my website. If you look on my website, you'll see how much trash goes in the ocean every 20 seconds. And so it's a vast amount going in, but no one knows how much is in there. But the good thing is that we're coming up with really smart solutions in not putting it in, and we're changing our behavior. So we're in that revolutionary time where we're facing some big challenges, and yet we're coming up with some very creative solutions. But I tell you, it's terrible to see the trash in the sea. It just breaks my heart every time I see it.
All right, Mrs. Searson's microphone's on.
Okay, Jessica, go ahead. What kind of animals live near you?
What kind of animals? That's a really nice question. I live in two places. I live in England, up in the Lake District, up in the northwest of England. I have a house right in the middle of the Lake District, and we are surrounded by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sheep. It's a very popular sheep farming place. So there's all kinds of other. There's cattle. There's really great fishing. There's foxes and all the rest. But mostly, if you came to my house in the Lake District, you'd see, wow, this man lives with thousands and thousands of sheep. In Switzerland, I live in Geneva, Switzerland. We move between the two, and around there, there are bears just a distance away, and we're very lucky in the fact that we've got a lot of reindeer not far away from us. So we're in a great place there. So yeah, great stuff. Sheep at one end, and reindeer and mountain animals at the other.
All right, back to our Nova Scotia class. Your microphone's on.
Have you ever found any new species of fish?
Yes, I have. I've been so lucky because diving with my team at National Geographic Pristine Seas, we go to places where most people don't. And on a lot of the deep dives in particular, we find new species of fish. In fact, the last time I spoke to Joe, we were in Colombia and we'd found some new species, very deep. It's 75 meters of water, 200 feet of water. So it's in the deep that we find the new species. In fact, with our remote drop cameras, which are these beautiful cameras that we drop all the way to the bottom, they've been to the very bottom of the ocean, the Mariana Trench and back. We nearly, on every drop, nearly every single dive, either find a new species or a new record of a species in that place. So yeah, it's a wonderful thing to find something new. I love coming up with the scientist and saying, hey, what was that little green guy or that big red thing? And the scientist says, do you know what? We've got no idea. That's a great moment.
Well, I think I forgot to mention, you brought up the drop cams. I was on the Nautilus for 2 weeks in October, and we were using the drop cams on the Nautilus, which was really cool. Yeah.
Joe, I could take one more question, then they're calling my flight. I've got to go get on the airplane.
Okay. Well, Paul, I think we'll do one more question, and then maybe on Twitter, maybe they can send you some more questions if they have some more.
Do you know what? That would be beautiful. Yeah, I mean, I'm on Twitter a lot. And my name is Paul_Rose. Joe can help you find it. It's Paul_Rose. And that would be fun, because when I get to the other end, I've got to go by train to BBC, and I'm traveling quite a bit now, and I would love to come up with questions, answer your questions, and help anything. So it's Paul_Rose. You'll see me. Joe can help, and I'll be delighted to hear from you. That's a terrific idea. Thank you.
All right, let's do that. Let's let you get on your plane.
Thank you, buddy.
Boys and girls, if you took any pictures or anything in class today, put those up on Twitter. Make sure you tag Paul in them at Paul_Rose. Send him more questions, and I know he'll get back. And Paul, looks like we'll see you in Costa Rica in a little bit.
Thank you, buddy. See you soon. Have fun. Hey, thank you, everybody from all schools. Thank you again, Joe.
All right, microphone's on. Nice and loud, everybody. Bye, everybody.